Hello, and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. Approaching. I'm really suffocated. My dogs. I'm a dog sandwich. Approaching the end of my list of idiosyncratic list of horror movies. They're not all idiosyncratic horror movies, but it's an unusual list. What do you think, Siku? What should I do for the last two? What should I do for the last two? I want to talk about. There we go. I want to talk about Saw 3, because why not? Saw 3 is another one of my favorite movies of all time. And it's definitely one where, if you consider the rules of the list that I've mentioned so far, it definitely is not one that I would pick to sound cool. It's definitely not in the canon, that's for sure. It definitely is not one that I have an ironic distance from. I do genuinely love it. But I love the whole Saw series for sure. And I think it's deeply underrated. I think it's one of those, my guess is my prediction, is it's one of those. I'm covered in dog hair. I'm absolutely covered in dog hair. It's one of those that I think probably came out at a time that was, to its own detriment, it was compared to the Hostel movies, and it became part of what was called the subgenre of torture porn. And porn, part of that name implies that it was really gratuitous, which functions as an interesting example of how we really define gratuitous. And commonly, gratuitous is defined as not having any social function, and I would totally disregard that as even being a relevant notion in a vast majority of horror movies. If a horror movie has a social function, and I mentioned this with The Stuff, for example, if it has social parody, satirical satire of consumerism, like in The Stuff, for example, or in, Dawn of the Dead, or anything like that, that's just a component. It's not really the function. So saying gratuitous doesn't necessarily apply there. And gratuitous in the sense that it doesn't function as character reflections of characters' development across the story, and commonly in horror that doesn't really happen, with the exception of maybe Final Girls, as I've talked about before. Sure, in a Hostel, it's really just torture for the sake of torture. It's intense visceral imagery for the sake of intense visceral imagery. And the Hostel movies are fine, for what they are. But how's that really different from any other horror movie? The characters are slightly more forgettable. I don't think that there's really any sort of relevant distinction there, but I think that was to the detriment of the Saw movies. The idea that they were doing something similar to what Hostel was doing. They're movies about torture for sure, but the nature of the torture was almost purely character based, and that was something that was unique about them, especially as compared to the Hostel movies. Hold on. Especially as compared to the Hostel movies. And just the dynamic of connections to the characters and the role of physical violence. The Hostel movies are basically light thrasher movies in that you have characters who, you're distanced from the characters just because they seem like terrible people. They get tortured. You have that visceral stimulation. The torture in the Hostel movies functions basically the same way that, really brutal sort of kills function in a Friday the 13th movie, for example. And that's not the Saw movies. It's sort of like with Hellraiser, got lumped into the Thrasher movies, and it really wasn't one. I would say that's true of the Saw movies as well. Because the tortures are almost purely character-based and almost purely, for the most part, designed to plumb the depths of a character. That is the whole function of them. So I'm not sure why they're designated as torture porn, or why that necessarily marked them as different from most other horror movies that spike that visceral stimulation. And arguably, they're even less. They qualify even less for that designation. And I think. Are you protecting me from monsters outside? So anyway, she's gonna warn me that there's somebody outside attacking, and so she's gonna squish me. Please don't start barking at random people crossing by on the street. I love you. I love you. Okay, I think they've stopped. The madness has stopped. No, it's still going. People were walking their dogs down the street, and Maggie and Siku had to make sure we were safe from any invasion of the people walking their dogs down the street. They might have tried to invade our house and take it over and attack us. So we are safe. We are totally safe. Are we safe, Maggie? Are we safe? We're safe. We're totally safe. Okay. So that being said, where was I even? So just the nature of the traps. They're really purely character based, and they're designed to develop a character. So they're designed with the basic concept that this particular torture is going to drive someone to their limit, the limit experience that Bataille talks about. It's going to drive somebody to their limit, so they break down the facade, they access that animalistic part of their core, they develop from some particular mode to some other mode. So they're doing precisely what, more quote-unquote serious, more quote-unquote artistic films are supposed to do. And I think just if you look at, the first three Saw movies, I think the series really finds its voice in what it's really trying to do by number 3. But the Saw movies are interesting because if you look at real, legitimate, genuine, hardcore fans, they'll rank them in very different ways. Just radically different ways, because each of the 7 movies does something a bit different. There's a little bit of a pattern here and there. But I think anyone who's not a fan will say, well, the first Saw movie was good, and then all the rest were just a bunch of copycats, and they just did the exact same thing every time. It's interesting. I mean, that's a case study of how really enjoying something gives you a very, very, very different perspective on just sort of casually engaging in it. Because I mean, some genuine fans will say number 1 is the best. Number 1 is sort of setting up the story structure, but it keeps ramping up with each one and presenting something new and different with each one. But also the series as a whole, it has this really complicated structure. So I mean, I think it's definitely an example of if you said good movies have a complicated structure and force their characters to grow and develop and change and face these problems that they can't overcome. Saw qualifies there, so it must be a serious artistic movie. Serious artistic movies have a complicated structure that really force you to to put all the pieces together. Well, Saw does that, so it must be a serious artistic movie. And that's what I'm saying. I think, it's a lot of the marketing is to the detriment of people taking the movie seriously. Who knows if that'll ever happen. But anyway, Saw 3, I think, is probably the best, just because, although I do love genuinely Saw 5 and 6. I think, though there's a case for Saw 5 and 6 also being the best, Saw 3 and 6 follow very similar sort of a pattern, and 6 probably has my favorite scene, easily, of any of the Saw movies, other than the Twisty Tim in Part 3, but Part 3 has Amanda, who's my favorite character in all the Saw movies. But Part 6 has the carousel trap, and that's just pure limited experience. And what's really beautiful about limited experience, and what's really just appealing and intense and fascinating about limited experience, is it takes a character from this, maybe a manipulative facade, or a facade of normalcy, and just strips all that away and gets down to this really pure humanity of the character. And the carousel trap does that in about 3 minutes, and it's just gorgeous. But it's this carousel, and it's an insurance salesman. There's political type of things here and there. Doesn't ruin the story. That's an inverse of that whole idea that it's really gratuitous. I think a political message could easily ruin the story. But the carousel, this guy has to choose. It's an insurance salesman, and so Jigsaw's trying to teach him about choosing who lives and who dies. And he has to choose between his partners. And there's this guy who's kind of flattering the insurance salesman and saying, this is a spoiler on this one trap, but he's saying, he's trying to kiss his butt and stuff like that, and trying to get him to choose him to live. And so and the insurance salesman ends up choosing 2 of his female assistants, and he's kind of basing his choice on that as the arbitrary criteria. And so the guy who was, the brown noser, who was really, really flattering just a second ago, says, "Oh, is that it? That's how it's gonna be." I should memorize this speech just because I love it so much. But is that it? Is that how it's gonna be? So he's about to die on this carousel, a shotgun or something like that. I think it's the shotgun. And so the insurance salesman's kind of looking away, and he's just ashamed that he had to make this choice, and he's looking away. And the brown noser says, "Look at me, look at me, look at me as you're killing me." Yeah, you're looking at me. You're looking at me too. You like that moment in the movie. Look at me. I'm gonna reenact it with dogs. Look at me. Look at me as you're killing me. Yeah, it's a great moment. I love it. Oh, what is this, sweet baby? I shouldn't talk about such vicious things when I have such sweet babies who are cuddling with me. I have both of them on top of me. Oh, God. You're squishing me. You're squishing me, sweet baby. It's such an adorable face. And then I get the vicious growler. Such an adorable face to talk about torture movies. But Saw 3, Saw 2 has, a few ups and downs here and there, but Saw 3 is just perfectly constructed. Saw 2 is a big mess. It's kind of just people free roaming in a house and running across random traps. So they're not as constructed to be really specifically about the person. Really basic example being the insurance salesman is really specifically about him. Choosing who lives and who dies. Who lives, who dies, the choice is yours. Saw 3 is about this guy why are you biting me? This guy who can't get over his child's death, and Jigsaw's trying to force him to get over it. And one of the great things about Jigsaw as a character... Why are you growling at me? You don't like Jigsaw as a character? He's a really fascinating character. I would say even more so. Hush. Even more so than, Pinhead is clearly one of my favorite horror characters. But he's great in his ambiguity. Hush. You hush. You hush. He's great in his ambiguity. His ambiguity trigger word that makes you bark. They want me to feed them. It is their supper time. This is why they're acting like this. I'm going to feed you in a second. Let me finish this. No patience. Doggies have no patience for be making videos about horror movies that I love and nobody else loves. Are you quite done? So, number 3, though, Jigsaw, on the surface, he's very moralistic, but you always get this reveal that he's really just this selfish prick. He's a horrible murderer, but he justifies his murder by saying, I'm not really killing people, I'm forcing them into this limit experience so that they're finally alive for the first time. And that's part of what makes Amanda such a great character, because she's a character who goes through this limit experience. She has the bear trap, the bear trap mask trap in movie number 1. They're squishing me. And her relationship with Jigsaw, mild spoiler there, is really based on that notion that Jigsaw is so superior because he has this moral that drives him to push people to their limit so that they are able to access this, inferior part of themselves. But the reveals very frequently show that Jigsaw's really just self-interested. And I think that's one thing that makes Part 6 relatively inferior, is that it's kind of this obvious part of the story that he's torturing the insurance salesman who refused to insure him for his cancer. You find out in Part 2 he has cancer. It's brain cancer. There's another just, unexpected thing about Jigsaw, is that a lot of what he's doing is motivated by the fact that he's dying, which is why I started making these videos. By the way, if you're just joining us, the reason I started making these videos is I'm not actually dying, but just this consciousness that, what if I die and I can't record. Okay, that's enough. What if I die and nobody knows just how much my doggies loved me? Stop. I can't record my concepts of how fiction works, because it is different from how most people think of it. Sick. And certainly my tremendous passion for Saw 3 as a film is going to ruin my credibility. I don't really care that much. When you have this sort of apocalyptic view, and when you're covered in dog hair, when you sort of have this apocalyptic view of, you have these valid beliefs, and this is maybe how I kind of relate to Jigsaw, I guess. I would never put anybody in a torture scenario, of course, but he has these things he believes in, and he's on the verge of dying from brain cancer, so he enacts this whole plan. But it turns out, his whole plan is really just really, really petty. And so just a really fascinating character in all 8 movies, really. Spoiler alert, he dies in Part 3. But all 8 movies are really just a deconstruction of his character. Which is why, just the whole idea that everything's so gratuitous is ridiculous. It's an 8-movie deconstruction of one guy's personality, framed with the deconstruction and the limit experience of dozens of other characters. It's a very, very character-based story. It's the most character-based story of any horror movie ever, really. Arguably. You don't get, even something like the Psycho series, which is, the first Psycho is very, very character-based. I mean, for the most part, you get a really character-based deconstruction of Norman Bates, but it's kind of all the same thing. he's not forcing other people to reassess the depths of their soul. But anyway, so part 3 has some of the best traps for sure. Like the twisty Tim trap, probably my favorite trap because it is such an emotionally intense trap. The strategy that most of horror movies of that kind take, which is emotional distance from characters who are killed by the villain, and a lot of the Saw people killed it creates this emotional distance so that the visceral stimulation is horror of, predation and biological death, and more so than tragedy, which is when you have a character that you really love who gets killed. You have sadness instead of fear. What the Twisty Tim trap does is, it indicates that the character who's in the Twisty Tim trap is probably innocent or probably a nice guy, and he has the worst torture, the most painful torture of anybody, and he just dies. I mean, and that's the complexity of the Jigsaw character, that he has this moral drive. He has what he believes is this great moral mission to teach people to access the most intense part of their souls and break away the facade and what have you. But he's really just an evil prick, and he's torturing this relatively, he's torturing a lot of relatively innocent people. But it really seems like the guy in the Twisty Tim trap is an innocent guy, and it just is horrible and intense and just wrenching. But anyway, it's one of my favorites, and it prominently features one of my favorite characters, Amanda, and all of her complexities, in direct contention with Jigsaw and all of his complexities, and the main character and all of his complexities. It's just an intense, deep diving character study for sure. But you really see just where you see the franchise really getting its own voice. And so, and 4 is not really my favorite, but 5 and 6 are really just owning that voice. And if you just look at 3, 5, and 6, it's just like a perfect trilogy of the series. And I like 2 too, but, and looking at 2, 3, 5, and 6, it's hard to really say that number 1 is really the best, for me at least. It's really just sort of exploring maybe what the series is trying to do and setting all of that up. Even though it has Michael Emerson and it has Danny Glover, it has all these great actors. Still, 3 is really the peak, arguably, of just the emotional intensity. But anyway, I don't know what I'm going to do for my number 1. I don't know what else I'm gonna say. I mean, I could talk about how much I love Human Centipede 2. Speaking of limited experience, Human Centipede 1 is similar sort of dynamic, where number 1 is sort of tiptoeing into the concept, and number 2 really goes all out for the concept to the extreme and really balances everything perfectly. And then number 3 just ramps it up really ridiculously. If you ask me, I think the Human Centipede series is deeply underrated as well. So, ruining my credibility completely based on these movies that I love and only I love. There's so many other ones that I'm not going to be able to fit in. Maybe I'll have an honorable mentions category of movies that don't quite make the top 11 or the top 10. Kind of like when Watch Mojo does it. Watch Mojo has some ridiculous lists, but I appreciate their honorable mentions at the very least. But anyway, now that I have this subtle message that the animals are no longer going to be patient and waiting for their supper, I'll see you on the next episode.